Welcome. For years, I was on the inside. I saw how power really works, how decisions are made, how secrets are kept. Then I exposed the truth about the deep state, and the deep state tried to ruin my life. But they failed. Because the American people deserve to know who is pulling the strings and why. This isn't theory, it's experience. My experience. I'm John Kiriakou. This is the deep state. I want to bring on now Jay Dyer. Jay is a well-known YouTuber, a Christian apologist, a theologian, and podcaster. He discusses topics from Christianity to geopolitics to the deep state. Jay, one of the most important issues on the international stage right now is the issue of the ever-expanding, ever-increasing number of Jewish settlements in traditionally Palestinian lands, especially, of course, in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. There was an article in Haaretz about a week ago saying that by Christmas of this year, there will be no Christians left in Nazareth. There have been Christians in Nazareth for more than 2,000 years, and they'll be gone. Bethlehem is another traditionally Christian city, before that a village, that will soon no longer be Christian. And that may account for the reason why there are so many Palestinian Christians in the United States. They've been forced out. Do you see any way to reverse this trend? Or is the U.S. government all in to help the Israeli government push religious minorities out of the Holy Land?
That's a great and difficult question. I think the key locus of change would have to be waking up more and more people to the problems of Christian Zionism. That's something that we focused a lot on my channel in the last several years. And, you know, so many people in the Bible Belt in the Midwest, they've really been captive to this false ideology, which makes them think that they have a religious duty to support a modern atheist socialistic nation state that was really sort of the experiment, you could say, of the British Empire and of, even before that, Rothschild interest to sort of set up a pilgrimage site, which eventually become a tool, a geopolitical tool of the British Empire. So there's really nothing explicitly Christian about it. And the more that you go into historic Christianity prior to modern evangelicalism, there's even less support for any idea of a nation state of Israel or some sort of Zionist state that we have a duty to support. So I think if we can really wrest away from the mindset, the grip that this idea has on so many people in America and the Bible Belt, we'll probably be a lot better down the road, at least in terms of removing this subversion. This foreign subversion is really what it is. And it's been entrenched for so long that it's really difficult to get rid of it. But beyond that, I think, beyond the theological side of it, there's the more geopolitical power influence of, control of foreign policy, which has really probably been there for decades, beyond past even, the time of Desert Storm and all that kind of stuff. I think we were doing Israel's bidding probably before that even. And I think you can demonstrate that. So if we can continue to battle within the political sphere, there's, at least in the last couple of years, as you know, there's been a huge rift within MAGA for those who are beginning to wake up to this and those who are, I would say, still agents of subversion and influence. So if we can continue to really push that rift, I think we can see some change.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because that was one of the things I wanted to jump into right away. Alan Dershowitz, the famous, maybe infamous professor emeritus of law at Harvard University, and the mentor to Senator Ted Cruz, once said that Ted Cruz was the smartest student that he ever had. But then in a recent interview, that I know, right? I got a chuckle out of it too.
It's hard not to giggle at that one, but yeah.
In a recent interview that Ted Cruz had with Tucker Carlson, he was intellectually unprepared for the questions that Tucker had for him about these very issues. Now, I'm a little bit embarrassed to tell you that years ago, I was an adjunct professor of intelligence studies at Liberty University, which is the biggest evangelical university in the world. I'm an Orthodox Christian, like you are. I'm not evangelical, But they liked my position on torture. They said that torture wasn't Christian, and would I like to teach these classes? I said yes, I'm glad that I did. They were lovely people, but we had fundamental disagreements on the role of evangelical Christianity in the Middle East.
Yeah.
I would posit that there is no role for evangelical Christianity in the Middle East, because evangelical Christianity, in my humble opinion, is an arm of Zionism. And so I was never able to wrap my head around how these Christians, or these people who call themselves Christians, with a straight face, can tell you that they're doing the right thing by supporting Israel as it wipes out ancient Christianity. Do you have any response to that? How is it that they're able to justify this policy to themselves?
Well, to quote John Hagee, against you, John, it's the blood moons. The blood moons of Israel show us that Jesus is not the Messiah. I couldn't resist throwing in a John Hagee.
John Hagee.
Now,
Oh boy, oh boy.
I was raised Southern Baptist, so I understand the mindset, and I can tell you that for many of the people in that milieu, it simply doesn't occur to them to think or question that way. They've never thought about what was Christianity like in the first 500,000 years of the church. What is the history of Christianity in the Middle East? For most Bible Belt, evangelical-minded people, as you would know from being at Liberty, I mean, it's just sort of a question they've never even entertained. And when I was 18 or 19, I remember buying my first Bible that I bought on my own that wasn't given to me by a Sunday school or whatever, was a prophecy study Bible. I remember buying it at a Christian bookstore, and I read it. I thought, oh, we're supposed to, just sort of default support the modern nation state of Israel because it's all this biblical prophecy stuff. And, we saw Trump a week or two ago saying, bless those that bless Israel. I will bless those. We all have a duty. Everybody has to support Israel no matter what. But that's all false, right? Because every one of the church fathers, 100% consistently across the board, all of those very people who put the Bible together, they were unanimous in their interpretation, like St. Paul in Galatians 6, the church is the spiritual Israel. So really it would be a kind of Judaizing move to go retrograde, to go back to the sort of Old Testament mindset, and to go back to what you said about the persecution of Christianity and sort of stamping it out in those cities. People need to understand, which I didn't understand when I was an evangelical Zionist, that rabbinical Judaism actually pronounces curses on what they call the minim. The minim are the Christians, and this goes back to the 2nd, 3rd century when there was this fissure between Judaism at that time, which was still proto-rabbinic Judaism, and Christianity going their separate ways. And part of what defines rabbinic Judaism is actually their anti-Christian stance. So that's what the attitude actually is. And if we understand that, I think most Bible Belt people think of Islam as a threat to the West. And I think that it is, as I've studied Islam in depthly the last 10 years or so. But they don't understand that it's the same idea, same ideology, perhaps even more vicious within the Talmudic and rabbinic teachings that really require serious practitioners of Judaism to use any means necessary really to get rid of Christianity. So everything you said is correct, but I just simply think that the people in the Bible Belt probably just never even entertained these types of questions.
With this expansion of settlements, with war against Iran, it's not just against Iran, it's against Lebanon, it's against Syria, it's against Christians in the West Bank. What do you think of the notion that's floating around now that the Israelis have been emboldened to the point where they might even consider attacking or dismantling the Al-Aqsa Mosque in order to then build the third temple, which they believe they are religiously driven to do, they've been commanded by God to do? Is that something that we should expect to see?
It's definitely a possibility. I think that if you study the history of Israeli operations, the Mossad, I'm certainly no expert. I've just read some books on it over the years. I don't think they would be at all beyond doing some sort of false flag or something like that. Right. It's very plausible. how they would go about that, or how that might happen. They could just simply say that Iran shot a missile or something like that, or it could be a bomb goes off, blame it on whoever. Certainly a possibility. And I think that, again, like we're saying with our previous audience of the sort of evangelical-minded people, they don't understand that there's the evangelical Zionist idea of the end times, and you have to kind of allow this stuff to happen, and Israel can do whatever it wants because they think this will further sort of the return of Christ and the rapture and the final millennium and all this kind of nonsense. But there's also the rabbinic idea, which is split between whether or not they have to be in the promised land and build the temple before the Messiah comes, or the other Orthodox Jews that think that they're not supposed to be there because the Messiah hasn't come. That's really a minority of them. So I think that there's definitely a possibility that they could engage in some type of a false flag, for sure. I mean, Israel has a history of using false flags, just like many nations have. So absolutely.
Yeah, help me understand the ideology of evangelical Christians, especially in the United States, because a lot of these beliefs you mentioned, for example, the rapture. The rapture is a late 19th century, British American Protestant development. It doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible or the ancient writings, etc. I was talking to the daughter of a friend of mine who is an evangelical Christian and has volunteered to go overseas and do some missionary work. I asked her where she was going, and she said North Macedonia. I said, why? She said, why not? I said, because they're already Christian. Why aren't you going to Africa, right? Or go to the Middle East somewhere? And she looked at me like I had two heads, because an Orthodox Christian's not a real Christian, right? I mean, isn't that what they're led to believe these days?
Absolutely. And to tie that in just briefly with what you mentioned earlier on, the idea that evangelical Christianity is also an arm of Zionism, and also an arm, I would argue, of the American Pentagon or deep state. There's a lot of history that goes into missionaries being used and recruited for intelligence work, for all kinds of stuff. Other countries, such as Russia, for example, ban groups like Jehovah's Witnesses or things like Scientology, because sometimes they're cut out, sometimes they're used for that stuff. So it's not just a matter of persecuting religious groups. It has to do, as you would know, with espionage. So there's that angle too, which the U.S. uses a lot of these evangelical groups for what it calls soft power, to try to promote American ideology in other countries. This was used heavily in the Ukraine, used heavily in the Cold War. There's giant historical, scholarly texts on that. But beyond that, I think you're right that for the evangelical mind, I don't think they would see these groups as really Christian. So they're just sort of nominally Christian or Christian in name. Funny you said that. I was actually on a evangelical guy's podcast the other day, and he was saying, I come from Lithuania. Everybody's nominally Christian. But in America, I really found evangelical true Christianity. And I just thought I was like, well, but what makes that true? And he's like, well, I had this experience, right? So it's very experiential and emotionally based. It's not actually based in sort of ritual and tradition and history. There's a lot of emotivism involved in that sort of evangelical Bible thumping, Billy Sunday style revivalist stuff that goes back to, you could say, America's founding with Puritans and the New Light and all that. Anyway, your question, though, I think was more so about why do we have to do this missionary work when they're already Christian? And I think it's just a defective and sort of ignorant view of Christianity, and not understanding that a lot of this is geopolitics and a lot of this is groups being used, and they don't even understand that they're being used. And that's a huge challenge. I've been talking about this for a long time, and probably not going to convince a lot of people in the Bible Belt that that their churches are being used for Israeli foreign policy. But actually, from the Tucker interview, from the Tucker interview and the Tuckabee interview, they're actually becoming more. They're becoming more and more aware that, Huckabee really had no idea what he was talking about, and Tucker really asked some pretty basic level questions, and there's a lot of fumbling. So this is causing quite a few people, I think, to at least maybe not get into the geopolitical stuff too heavy, but at least question, well, wait a minute, why are we supposed to do whatever Israel says? What does that have to do, with American foreign policy? And here's Trump doing pretty good things the second round, and then suddenly everything's sort of going haywire once he's got to listen to whatever Bibi says.
Stay with us, Jay. We're going to take a short break and come right back. When we come back, we will have more with Jay Dyer. I'm John Kiriakou, and this is The Deep State. Stay right there. Welcome back to The Deep State. I'm John Kiriakou. We're joined back again today by our guest, Jay Dyer, podcaster, theologian, and expert debater. Thanks so much for being with us, Jay. One of the things that has always struck me about evangelicals and their sort of religious political ideology is they believe they can force God's hand by encouraging Jews to move to Israel, for example, right? Because the Messiah can't come back until all the Jews have returned to Israel. But they just don't get that it's not up to man to make that decision and to force God's hand. They really believe that this is something that they can accomplish. And that's why they won't even engage you in a conversation about the rightness or the wrongfulness of a policy like that.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually challenged quite a few proponents of this over the last year or 2 years to a public debate. I had some back and forth with Dinesh D'Souza, who's a massive Christian Zionist. And of course, he would not do it. He declined multiple times. Some of the other big evangelical megachurch pastors, I've tried to reach out and get them to have some kind of engagement or discussion. And of course, none of them would actually do it. So it was really surprising to me that Huckabee and what's his face were actually willing to do that interview, because it's almost like they were. I mean, it's like they live in another reality almost, right? And I say that because I grew up with Baptist pastors, and I think Mike Huckabee, in that interview, he came off as the archetypal Baptist pastor that I grew up with. And so to see that kind of an archetype, really just sort of fumble and just sort of melt in the midst of that basic level of questioning was a huge blow. But yeah, I don't think that that those questions are ever asked by the evangelical mindset. But I'm glad that they're being forced to ask these questions now, because it's really, as you know, these are the types of things that can really undo the country.
Yes,
right.
Without a
and
doubt.
it doesn't mean that if we don't do Israeli foreign policy that we have to suddenly hate all Jews or hate people. Everything is always cast in a propaganda way, in a false dialectic of, oh, if you don't support whatever Bibi says, then you must hate all Jews or something like that. That's a false dichotomy. That's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow that because I don't want to do their foreign policy that I hate them. But it's just not rational. It's not Christian. It's not sensible. It's ahistorical. And like you said, the whole rapture ideology was really invented and pushed by famous Zionists in America like Samuel Untermyer. He was a huge part of why Schofield was able to get that whole movement and idea going throughout the Bible Belt. And you being Orthodox, you don't think about it like a Baptist thinks about it, like where you grow up just reading this book, and sort of the book is sort of the end all be all, and you don't even think about, well, who put the book together and what's the history behind the book, right? And then when you start asking those questions, a lot of times, as I did in my 20s, it tends to lead you out of the Baptist mindset, and you begin to also realize, well, maybe this recent eschatological view of the rapture and the millennium and all that, maybe that's a new teaching. Maybe that's not actually a biblical ancient teaching. And when you realize that, one of the most powerful verses, and I know this doesn't have to be a big theology chat, but in Matthew 21:43, Jesus gives a parable, and he says to the Jews, to the Pharisees, he says, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a nation producing the fruits thereof. The nation there being, I think, the Gentile and Jewish church that was soon to emerge, which would supplant and really be the fulfillment of what the flesh nation state of Israel was. And I remember reading that as an evangelical Zionist, and I thought, man, this really doesn't work with my theology of when Jesus comes back, he'll set up that earthly kingdom in Israel. And we have to do what the nation state of Israel wants because that's God's chosen people. Jesus is simply literally saying, no, in this first advent, this kingdom is taken from you. It's not your possession anymore. It's the church.
I want to ask you about an article that was published in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. It was a fascinating piece to me, and it was essentially something that we Orthodox already knew, that there were more conversions from evangelical Protestantism in the United States to the Orthodox Church than to any other denomination or any other faith. And primarily that's because people are searching for tradition, right? They're searching for something with a history. If you're Orthodox, you've known that all your life. Especially the Antiochian Orthodox Church or the Orthodox Church in America. There are, in many parishes, majority converts that make up the parish. It's a wonderful thing. That's not how the New York Times meant it. The New York Times meant it to be that this was something that we should be worried about because these converts to Orthodoxy are very conservative, and some of them are extremely right-wing or alt-right, and they believe, God forbid, they believe in a traditional home where the woman doesn't work outside the home, and other silliness through this article. A similar article was published in 2005 that didn't have all the negatives attached to it, but they were saying, this Orthodox Church is something that's very appealing to people who feel like they're missing something in evangelical Christianity, especially in the United States. Why do you think that there was this pushback against Orthodoxy by a mainstream outlet like the New York Times? Why wouldn't they have presented this as, hey, there's something interesting going on in the religious community in America, here's what it is? Why was this something that we should fear?
The establishment left in America, and particularly through the outlets like New York Times and even the fake conservative outlets. I've been approached a lot of DMs from Wall Street Journal, these types of organizations that have reached out to say, hey, you end up doing a lot of these debates. I'd like to talk to you about why Orthodoxy is growing and this and that. There's probably been 5 or 10 of those over the last several years. And I always say no, because I know that they're going to write a hit piece and try to say that I'm a follower of, Tiny Mustache Man, even though I critique eugenics and that whole ideology all the time. So I tend to just assume that they're going to be hit pieces. And I did see what you're talking about. And I think that, from the vantage point of the establishment, they're always interested in what the intellectual currents are, what the reaction will be to the prevailing status quo. And so they're probably looking to see what the trend is and why is this trend happening? Who's the voices of this? So I think they're probably figuring out who to target, who to try to take down, who to, make look bad. And they always default to the same really weak ad hominems that just don't work anymore. I mean, it used to work 20 years ago if mainstream media said somebody was a bad person. But now that the establishment defends the most degenerate practices, harming children with cutting off their genitalia, nobody perceives them to have a moral high ground anymore. So I just don't think it's effective. It doesn't work like it used to. The same with calling everybody anti-Semitic for critiquing Zionism or for Israeli foreign policy. It's lost its power, which is something that, Twitter has helped to affect in the last couple of years.
Yes.
And it's funny because, there's that old interview with Victor Ostrowski who wrote, By Way of Deception. He's on YouTube and he's like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, saying at C-SPAN, he's like, yeah, it's a trick we use. If somebody says something you don't like, you just call them anti-Semitic. So anyway, that's the reason why they're doing it, is to make us look bad, but it doesn't work. But also I think that, like you said, the internet is forcing people to ask questions that they probably never would have asked, especially the younger you go. Now, there's downsides, obviously, to Gen Z, Gen Alpha spending all their time on the internet. But there's also perhaps some upsides, which is that quite a few of them are beginning to ask questions and find answers a lot quicker than boomers or Gen X could even imagine. For example, I remember I forget who it was, I was reading somebody, they were saying that basically, what a CIA section chief would have spent months trying to, find sources for and get collated information to pass on to somebody in the 1970s, 60s, or 70s. You can basically collate that information and get those answers within a few minutes nowadays. So it's like, and I know there's downsides to AI. I'm not touting AI. I'm just saying that if you know what you're doing, you can really find, solid answers. And so the younger you get, the more people are saying, well, wait a minute, why are we supposed to just do whatever Israel says? This question is still mind-boggling to most boomers, especially evangelical boomers, right?
Yeah.
This is just, you just don't even ask that. It's not even a question within the domain of what types of questions can be asked. So I think the younger you go, the more radical the questioning is, and it's more normative. And so there's a quickening amongst that group to see the lack of foundations for a lot of the evangelical ideas, whether it's the Zionist dispensational end time stuff, or whether it's no tradition, no liturgy, no history, just sort of Billy Bob Baptist, strip mall, do it on your own type of church. I think people are really quickly seeing through a lot of the flimsiness of the foundations.
And thank you for watching. This is The Deep State, and I'm John Kiriakou. We'll see you next time.